All of us are flesh, bone and humours. The sooner you realise that, the sooner you can get on with life. Of course, in Gallows Corner, characters are also dice, and in this video we're going to talk about using your dice to make tests, and how sometimes skills can replace those tests entirely. During character creation, each player will have assigned their 3 EXP dice, 2 d6s and a d8, to their traits: physical, intellectual and emotional. They'll also have chosen a trade, giving them a d6 trade dice, and a job, giving them a d6 job dice. Finally, they'll also have chosen one of their job's 4 skills, noting that down on their character sheet. This means that, at the start of your journey, your character will have 5 dice, which are 4 d6s and a d8, and a skill. These are the raw materials for making tests, moments where your narrator calls on you to overcome a challenge or influence a scenario. In Gallows Corner, we encourage players and narrators to play narrative first. In practice, this means players should prioritise talking and role-playing their way through the story and its difficulties. However, not every situation can be resolved in this way. In those moments, the narrator will call for a test. Rather than asking the player being tested to roll a specific dice or a combination of dice, the narrator will state clearly and unambiguously what the character is being tested on. For example, the narrator might say, "You are being tested to see if you can convince this crowd of angry peasants to join you and storm the local manor." With this information, the player must then decide which dice from their collection they are going to use to attempt this test. To do this, we follow a certain formula that you should always follow. Step 1. Players choose which of their EXP dice is most appropriate for the test. This is normally pretty simple. For a physical challenge, choose your physical dice. For a social challenge, you'll normally choose emotional, but sometimes you might want to choose your intellectual dice depending on the task at hand. And for when you're trying to solve problems, win an argument, or convince someone about something, you'll normally choose intellectual. Note though that there is often a case to be made for using more than one of your EXP dice. Let's look at our example, when a player is trying to convince an angry mob to join them and storm a manor. It's obvious that the first EXP dice the player will choose is their emotional dice. After all, you're appealing to this mob's sense of injustice and trying to channel their anger. That one is pretty clear. But can we make arguments for adding either the physical or intellectual dice too? If the player stated that they were trying to convince the mob by showing their own strength and that they will be there fighting alongside them, then they could absolutely argue to add their physical dice. On the other hand, if the player wanted to convince the crowd through appeals to the idea of divine justice, or the inalienable rights of the people, or just to demonstrate to them that there is a weakness that can be exploited, they could argue to add their intellectual dice to the test. So, step 1, choose at least one, but potentially more, of your EXP dice as the foundation of the test. Step 2, determine if the character's trade is relevant to the test. This step could be tricky, but there is a simple way to determine if a trade is relevant. Think about the name of the character's trade: the body, the earth, the flesh, the hood, the market, the mask, the mind, or the stranger. And think about the general skills and abilities someone who is part of that trade might have. Those with the body trade know what it means to work physically, to put their bodies on the line and do a hard day's graft. Those with the mind trade, on the other hand, know what it is to think about a problem, to study and analyse and problem solve. Those from the mask know how to work a crowd, to stand out and to convince, while those from the stranger know how to turn their outsider status to their advantage. If you think your trade is relevant to the test, tell the narrator how and why. If they agree, add your TRA dice to the test. Remember, at this stage, it's all about how you justify your claim. In our example, a character with the body trade might be able to argue that they are physically strong and skillful, and so can inspire confidence in the hungry crowd. This would be a bit of a stretch, but a narrator might be convinced. A character with the mask trade is very used to winning over a crowd, so this would be an easy case to make. Those with the earth, the flesh, the market, or the stranger as trades would be hard pressed to make a case in this scenario, though it isn't impossible. If the player can make the case that their trade is relevant, they add their TRA dice to the test and move on to step 3. For those unable to make the case, they move on to step 4, attempting the test with just their EXP dice from step 1. Step 3. Determine if the character's job is relevant to the test. This is a simpler proposition. If the player believes their character's job and the skills, abilities and experiences they have gained from it are relevant to the test, they can add that job dice to the test. It is rarer to add a job dice to a test, given that jobs are far more specific than trades, but players should always feel free to make their case. In the example we've been using, a farmer, an astrologer, a smith, a midwife, a pickpocket, a dung farmer, a miner or a musician are unlikely to be able to make the case that their job is relevant to the test. But a soldier, a bailiff or an officer, there are definitely cases to be made with those jobs. If the case is made and the narrator agrees, the player may add that job dice to the test. Finally, step 4, rolling the dice and determining the outcome. Regardless of how many dice the player is using to make the test, from a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 5, tests are always made in the same way. The player rolls the dice they've chosen for the test and sees if any among them are a result of 5 or above. If there is one or more result of 5 or above to be found, then the test is successful and the narrator and player resolve the situation accordingly. Finally, we have skills. In Gallows Corner, skills are narratively determined. They do not have fixed mechanical effects. Instead, they are left open to interpretation by the player. A skill is something your character can just do. If you think a skill is relevant when being tested, say so. Tell your narrator how and why you think it should replace the dice roll. If they agree, and remember that narrators are encouraged to be open to such suggestions, the skill replaces the need for a roll and the test is resolved successfully. Nice and easy. So there we have it, dice, tests and skills. Remember, when making a test, choose your EXP dice first, then your trade, and then your job. You can only add one once the former has been accepted, so no making a test just with your job dice, or with just an EXP and a job dice. And don't forget, skills replace the need for rolls. Advocate for yourself and for others. After all, in Gallows Corner, you are what you do, so start doing.